Hello, good evening. We hope you're doing a very good job for all European countries at the moment. Okay, so good evening, dobar večer, everybody. I'm Milena Deleva of Elizabeth Kostova Foundation, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you at the second and the last day of our multi-event gala, the first gala in our 13 years of existence. The Elizabeth Kostova Foundation was established back in 2007 by the American writer Elizabeth Kostova in order to support contemporary Bulgarian literature. And in the meantime, we have grown to small but mighty international nonprofit with programs both public and professional in Bulgaria, in the US, and few in the UK. And now we are all online for the time of being. It's a great honor to have GEORGI Gospodinov and Angela RODEL with us tonight. And later on, we will be joined by Linda Gregerson and NADYA RADULOVA, as well as by the jazz musician Peter SLAVOV. We are very grateful for participating in our gala in support of our work. All of them have embarked on wondrous literary journeys by translating Bulgarian literature into English, by translating American literature into Bulgarian, and you will stay tuned until the end so you can hear all about it. And for better quality experience, please use your headphones if you can for the music intermission 1 hour from now. This is view-only webinar, and although we don't see you, we would love to hear from you. So after each conversation, we will have 10-15 minutes time to hear from you via the chat. So please use the chat for comments and the Q&A for questions. Again, chat for comments and Q&A for questions, so we can handle them much easier and answer more questions. 2020 has been challenging here for everybody. Now, as we speak, Bulgaria is having actually hard time facing COVID. So thank you very much, everybody, not only that you are here, but for your time and commitment and support, given that there are so many urgent causes at the moment. I would like to thank the cultural institutions who actually helped our work a lot throughout this year. I'll just briefly acknowledge the names of all organizations that were with us and made our programs possible this year. The National Culture Fund in Bulgaria, the calendar of cultural events of Sofia Municipality, the New York Council on the Arts, the US Embassy in Bulgaria, the program culture of the municipality in Sofia, the National Center for Writing in Norwich, UK, our long-term partner Open Letter Books, with whom we've been publishing 6 Bulgarian novels, and the 7th one is forthcoming, the Louis Roth Endowment, the Tiana Dera Foundation, and Honey Bunch, our creative partner, and finally our pro bono accounting service, Cody Scott and Company. We are very grateful to everybody who also contributed to this gala. Many people purchased tickets and they qualify as friends. But even if you don't, you are a friend. Even if you did the cyber trip to our website and get familiar to the writers and the translators and their work, you are a friend, and friends raising is bigger than fundraising. And we would like to acknowledge everybody who actually donated $100 or more for this specific event. And you see the names of everybody who is a donor or a patron or Peugeot and Panda. And we still have these 2 untapped levels, Nestinarka and Cookier. I encourage you to go to our website and explore their symbolic value. With that being said, I just actually will stop this presentation, and I will turn it over to our board member, Kevin Larimer, who is the editor-in-chief at Poets and Writers, who has been to our programs several times. We are grateful for his time on this Saturday. Thank you so much, Kevin. Now the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much, Milena. I'm so happy to be here today to introduce the program for day 2 of our gala. But before I do, I just want to say a bit about my experience with this incredible organization. I was introduced to EKF through the words of fellow board member Jeremiah Chamberlain, who got in touch with me back in 2010. It's hard to believe it was 10 years ago, but he reached out to tell me that he had just received a fellowship to attend the Sozopol fiction seminars. He was very excited. And he wanted to know if I'd like an article about his experience for Poets and Writers magazine. I did, of course. And from that day forward, I started to learn, about the organization's incredibly important work to support, encourage, and promote literary writers in Bulgaria, and to create connections among Bulgarian, American, and British literary communities. I published the article about Jeremy's experience in Sozopol, and later Angela RODEL's experience as a translator in Bulgaria, and her work that is, as she put it, a bridge through which the international literary community has come to know so many wonderful Bulgarian works. And by doing so, I began to learn about the organization's vital support of literary translators and its programs and events, both in person and virtual, that connect cultures and engage readers and writers, raising interest in contemporary literature. And I was fortunate to get to see firsthand the impact that this work has on the lives of writers when I attended the Sozopol fiction seminars in 2014 and the poetry conference in Koprivstica in 2015. It is not an understatement to say that I was completely and utterly unprepared for how hard I fell in love with the literary culture of Bulgaria, the voices of its authors, the rich history of its literature, and their sincere warmth and really genuine openness in welcoming American and British writers and editors like myself to their beautiful country. The programs that EKF put together every year are dynamic and inspiring and informative, truly life-changing for the Sozopol fellows I know. And I will never forget the events I was fortunate to be a part of, but if I'm honest, I have to say, I think it was the meals that changed my outlook. My perspective on the writer's life. The simple act of sitting down together as writers from different cultures, as creative thinkers, to share a meal and talk about art and politics and history and writing, always the writing, right? I truly believe this kind of international dialogue can change the world in small and large ways. And this is what the Elizabeth Kostova Foundation makes possible. So I hope that you'll consider making a donation to ensure that this work continues, even now, especially now, when so many of our world's borders are closed to us and we shelter in place amid the pandemic. And while I wish we were all in the same room together, sharing a meal together, perhaps, we come together now with the same goal of opening a dialogue with one another. And this is actually perfect because Zoom knows no borders, right? It's a beautiful way of showcasing the true internationalism of this organization's work. The theme of this year's gala, hostility and hospitality, resonates today, especially when there's so much hostility and division, certainly in American politics, but also around the world with growing nationalist movements and so much hostility ignited by the ongoing pandemic and the migratory crises in Asia, Europe, Africa, and the Americas. But the spirit of hospitality is the reason I'm here. That's why we're all here. The hospitality that I feel whenever I travel to Bulgaria, it's what I felt while listening to Bulgarian writers singing folk songs after dinner in Koprivstica, or in the early morning hours drinking rakia in front of Hotel Diamanti above the Black Sea. And it's the spirit of hospitality that Elizabeth Kostova brings to everything she does. Thank you, Elizabeth. And thank you, Milena, and everyone involved with the Elizabeth Kostova Foundation. So please take this opportunity to make a generous donation to the foundation to ensure that this work, this hospitality continues. We have an amazing program for day 2 of our gala. We're joined by Angela RODEL and GEORGI GOSPODINOV, followed by a musical performance by Peter SLAVOV, and finally, Linda Gregerson and NADYA RADULOVA. Thank you so much for joining us today in support of the Elizabeth Kostova Foundation, and please enjoy the program.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for those kind words. And I'd like to echo much of what Kevin said. First of all, the thank yous to Milena Deleva for the invitation, to Elizabeth Kostova for all the wonderful work she does to promote Bulgarian literature and translation, and of course, to the whole team that makes the Elizabeth Kostova Foundation possible. Thank you. And I guess before we dive in, I should introduce myself, although Kevin did a very nice job, and I thank him for the warm words. I'm Angela RODEL. I'm a translator from Bulgarian into English. It's interesting that he mentioned that quote about being a bridge. Georgi and I decided this was the closest we could get to Brooklyn, sort of artistic rendition of the Brooklyn Bridge here in Sofia. So we're with you in spirit. But we really felt that the work we do as writers, as translators, is a bridge to open up the world of Bulgarian culture to readers around the world. I've been translating about as long as the Elizabeth Kostova Foundation has existed. I think that's probably serendipitous. I started in about 2006 translating seriously. I'd been a student of Russian and Russian literature, but fell in love with Bulgarian music, Bulgarian culture, Bulgarian language, and have never looked back. But the real star of this evening is GEORGI GOSPODINOV, who probably does not need an introduction to this group, but I will give one anyway. His debut novel, Natural Novel, in 1999 was, I'd say, a breakaway hit. It was published in 23 languages, including English, but also French, German, Italian, Spanish. His second novel, The Physics of Sorrow, which came out in 2012, was translated into 18 languages and counting. It won the Central European Angelus Award in 2019 and the International Jan Michalski Prize for Literature in 2016. It was a finalist for 6 international prizes in Europe and the US, among them Premio Strega Europeo, Haus de Culturen der Welt Literaturpreis, Brücke Berlin Prize, and American Pen Translation Prize. He was also a Cullman Fellow at the New York Public Library in 2017-18, so he's a native New Yorker at heart after that year. I think we'll talk about actually The Physics of Sorrow we'll talk about quite a bit tonight, and then we're going to talk about his latest book, Time Shelter. But I think our friend and fellow Bulgarophile Garth Greenwell, when he wrote in The New Yorker, he said, quote, "Georgi's real quest in The Physics of Sorrow is to find a way to live with sadness, to allow it to be a source of empathy and salutary hesitation." And I think those words really resonate with what we've all been through in 2020. We've all been struggling of how to deal with sadness, how to deal with isolation, how to deal with loneliness and with loss. So I'm looking forward to hearing what Georgi has to say on some of these topics. But to not get too heavy too fast, some kind of fun tidbits. After The Physics of Sorrow was published in Bulgarian, Georgi was made an honorary member of the Union of Physicists in Bulgaria, which he proudly maintains till this day. He also published a children's book with his daughter Raya. And at the Brooklyn Lit Festival in 2017, he was the ping pong tournament second place prize winner. So watch out, he's a man of many talents. But I guess we should start from the beginning, Georgi. When did you start writing? What inspired you to write?
Okay, thank you for this presentation. I want to say first thank you to Elizabeth Kostova personally, and to Elizabeth Kostova Foundation, and to Milena Deleva for everything that they are doing. I think it's important just now in the world where we are living, to have this support for our stories, because literature and storytelling and our stories will become more and more important, and exchanging these stories. So thank you again. And from the beginning, I have actually 2 stories for the beginning. Okay, I will start with one. If you ask me for the second one later, I could tell it again. I had a nightmare. So everything started with nightmare. I was 7, 8 years old, and I had a nightmare. It was like that my parents and my brother are on the bottom of the well, and I'm outside. I'm safe, but I'm abandoned. I'm alone, and I have double fear. First fear about them, that they will stay there and they will never go out. And the second one about myself, how they dare to leave me alone outside. And it was a terrible nightmare. I dreamed every night. And then I decided to tell it to my grandmother. I used to live with my grandparents in this time. And she stopped me and said, please don't tell me this, your nightmare, because in Bulgarian village where I used to live, they believe that if you tell your nightmare, it will become fulfilled with blood, as my grandmother said. So it will, yeah, alive. Anyway, and then I decided to write down this nightmare. I just started to write very ugly letters, and I wrote down this nightmare, and two things happened after that. Never again I dreamed this nightmare. It never repeated again. And I never forgot it, of course. So this is that's the what to say, the profit of the writing.
So many children dream about being writers. You became a writer to escape your dreams. So interesting.
Nightmares.
Exactly, escape your nightmare. But so let's start first about the physics of sorrow. It has a really interesting title in Bulgarian, which caused me no end of hair pulling. It's the Physica na tagata. Taga is a very Bulgarian concept, which is difficult to translate. So why did you pick this word as your title, and what does that word mean to you?
It's a beautiful word, taga. If you try now to say this word, taga, please say taga. You will see how your Adam apple moving, and it's like as if you want to swallowing something, as if you're swallowing something that you don't want to say. And this is, yeah, for me it's one of the most beautiful words in Bulgaria. Taga. It's a short word, but the feeling that it describes is long and slow. The Bulgarian taga is a slow thing. And so that's why I like this word. And also, when I started to write my novel, I didn't have this title, of course. And I read this article in Economist, the saddest place in the world. This was an article about Bulgaria. So Bulgaria was the saddest place in the world. It was 2010, I think. And then I decided to explain, okay, is there something like Bulgarian sorrow? Is it something very specific? Is it different from other famous sorrows? Because we know this imperial or post-imperial sorrows of the big countries like Turkish hüzün or Portuguese saudade. What's the difference? And I could tell with one sentence. The difference is that Turkish hüzün and Portuguese saudade it's a sorrow of the big empire that possessed half of the world and then lost this half of the world. The Bulgarian sorrow is a sorrow of the society or country that never possessed something, but also lost this. That never possessed, if I can say this. So Bulgarian sorrow is a sorrow on the second degree, on the second level. It's a sorrow about things that never happened. And this is very important. In the physics of sorrow, for me, it was important to tell stories about the things that never happened, and that these unhappened things accumulate Bulgarian sorrow. Because what is not happened, it's very difficult to narrate it. It's very difficult to explain it. It's very difficult to put this unhappened thing into novels or short stories or poems. Yeah, that's why sorrow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was very difficult to translate because it has a sense of not just sadness, but melancholy, regret, nostalgia, all those things. And so I think ultimately I liked sorrow because it was short and sweet, that taga, sorrow. Melancholy seemed a little too long and drawn out, and it sort of seems sort of Freudian, I think, to, to many of us in the English language tradition. And so, but it's a very, I'm not sure that we have anything quite equivalent, unfortunately.
Actually, it's a big problem in all languages. In Turkish, it's hüzün fizici, and in Italian, it's melancholy because melancholy sounds more lighter. And it's tuga, taga, Schwermut in Germany. Schwermut is a very good word for this because there is something schwer, heavy in this. But also not the same like taga, because in taga, there is something from this Slavic concept about the taska, about dreaming of something that you never had and maybe never will happen. But there is a kind of lightness in this. I don't know.
Yeah, one other really interesting aspect of the physics of sorrow is the Minotaur. And I think many of us studied the Minotaur as a monster. And in your book, you turn that myth on its head. And basically the Minotaur is like that little boy who started writing, a child afraid to be abandoned. And I was just wondering, what was the inspiration for reinterpreting the myth of the Minotaur in the Labyrinth?
By the way, in the beginning of writing of this novel, The Physics of Sorrow, was this scene from my childhood. We used to live in a sidewalk room, and the window was on the level of the sidewalk. And so I spent all my late afternoons sitting on the window, alone in the room, with the face to the window and back to the darkness in the room. I was afraid. My parents were, that they worked. And this feeling of loneliness and abandonment is something that I wanted to describe in my novel. And then the Minotaur was my, what to say, invisible friend from the myth. And I was sure. And if you read carefully the myth again, you will see that Minotaur is really 2-3 years old abandoned child who was locked in the basement of his father Minos. And by the way, I made a small research and I found one, what to say, picture on the vase from antique times, Pasiphae with the Minotaur.
I believe it's in the book.
I could show. I put it in my book, but here you can see it on the cover. It's like Madonna with the Minotaur. You know, this is the Minotaur is a small child, maybe 1-2 year old, with a bullhead, and this is really iconic image. This is like Madonna with the Minotaur, but this is Pasiphae with the little Minotaur. Anyway, for me, what's important that Minotaur is not this beast or monster that we described. And for me, what's important to give the voice of this creature, because if you read the whole mythology, if you read after that Ovid and other authors, you will see that in this mythology that everything was speaking, only the Minotaur doesn't have voice. So yeah, the novel started with this, with the picture of a 10-year-old boy who is sitting in one room and reading about the Minotaur, another boy who is sitting in a basement of his father Minos.
Wonderful. I think we're going to hear a musical interpretation based on your book from Petr Slavov in defense of the Minotaur in
maybe we could hear after that.
Yeah, great. Well, perhaps we should then turn to your newest book, Time Shelter. There are a lot of themes that are similar, I think. There's a theme of memory that we have a lot of in physics, but it's also, I think, even more emphasized, the themes of forgetting, the idea of the past and disintegration. These are things that have ideas that have run through much of your work, your poetry, your nonfiction, your essays. Why don't you just give us a brief overview of Time Shelter?
I finished the book in the end of 2019, before everything, what happened still exists. And actually it was published in April in Bulgaria this year, in the middle of or in the peak of the quarantine. All bookshops were closed. And yeah, it's a book about time shelters. It's a book about how to live when the future is denied to us and when the present is not our home. Mm-hmm. How we built our time shelters in the past. And is it dangerous or is it safety for us? It's about Agustin again, but this time Agustin has a really, big project to make his clinics for the past or rooms for the past, but maybe it's better to read part of the novel.
Yeah, great. Do you want to read a little bit in Bulgarian?
A little bit, yes.
Okay. So this is from Time Shelter.
This is from the beginning of the book. Цялата поляна отпред беше поръсена с незабравки. Тук-там избухваха божури и едни големи червени макове. Но ситните незабравки си нееха сред швейцарско зеленото на тревата. Сигурен съм, че има швейцарско зелено. Чудя се как никой не го е патентовал. Дали имаше шега в това да засадиш незабравки пред Геронто психиатричен център? Качи се на последния етаж, където беше клиниката на Галстин, сплатен за няколко години наем от господин С, натиснах звънеца и самият Галстин в поло и големи кръгли очила не отвори вратата.
Great. Now I'll read an extended excerpt in English. So this is from Time Shelter, Rooms of the Past. The whole meadow out front was dotted with forget-me-nots. Here and there peonies and some big red poppies erupted. But the petite forget-me-nots shone blue amid the Swiss green of the grass. I'm sure that Swiss green exists. I can't believe somebody hasn't patented it yet. Is it some sort of joke, planting forget-me-nots in front of a geriatric psychiatric center? I went up to the top floor where Gaustin's clinic was, with several years' rent paid in advance by Mr. S. I rang the doorbell, and Gaustin himself in a turtleneck and big round glasses opened the door onto 1960. Weren't you heading to New York in 1939 last time I saw you? I quipped as casually as I could. When did you get back? After the war, he replied, unruffled. So what are we going to do now? Rooms from different times, as a start. Rooms of the Past? It sounds like a title. Yes, Rooms of the Past, or a clinic of the past, or a city. Are you in? I had just gotten divorced, with the vague idea of trying to make a living thinking up stories. I had a soft spot for the 60s. I tumbled easily into any past, but of course, I did have my favorite decades. I had no good reason not to stay for a short while, a month or two at most. In the beginning, Gaustin occupied only one of the 3 apartments on the top floor. The smallest space near the front door, the servants' quarters, as he called it, and it's highly probable that this is exactly what it had been used for, was now his office. The other 3 rooms of the apartment, including the hallway, were in another time. You open the door and fall directly into the middle of the 60s. The entryway with the classic coat rack and bench ensemble, dark green made of fake leather with brass studs. We had one like it at home. I should say that although I was born at the tail end of the 60s, I remember them clearly, from beginning to end, and they are part of my Bulgarian childhood, not due to mystical reasons, although I continue to believe that memories are passed down directly from parent to child. The reason I have them in my head is actually quite trivial. The 1960s, just like everything in Bulgaria, were simply delayed and arrived 10 or so years later, most likely during the 1970s. A light green coat with 2 rows of wooden buttons was hanging from the coat rack. I remember that when I stepped in for the first time that morning, I froze when I saw it. That was my mother's coat. It was as if any second she would open the living room door, the typical beveled glass would glint, and she would be standing there, young, 20-something, much younger than I am now. even though when your mother appears at 20, you automatically turn into a child as well. And at that moment of awkwardness and joy, you wonder whether to hug her or simply to casually call out, "Hey mom, I'm home, I'm going to my room." All this lasted only a second or a minute. "Welcome to the 60s, Gaustine smiled, observing my shock in the entryway to the decade with a furtive smirk. I didn't want to leave my imagination just yet and immediately turned towards the kids' room. 2 twin beds in the corner, each covered in a yellow shag comforter made of some fake fiber. We called it NADYA back then. It must have been an abbreviation, with a brown chest between them, the 2 beds meeting perpendicularly at the chest. I glanced at Gaustine, he understood and nodded, and I threw myself down on the bed, just as I was in my jacket, shoes, and 50-year-old body, and landed in my 8-year-old body amidst the tickling fringe of the comforter. In the next room, I wanted to help myself to the box of chocolate candies wrapped in tinfoil on the coffee table. I reached towards it, then stopped. Wait, when are these chocolates from? They're fresh, from the 1960s, Gaustine smiled. Does the past have an expiration date? Great, so Gaustine, the figure of Gaustine is an interesting part of, I think, your meta-literary legacy. He's a figure that's popped up in many different works of yours. Can you give us, how did you come up with the idea of Gaustine and what role does he play in your work?
Yeah. For the first time, Gaustine appeared in my poetry book, The Charity of a Nation, in 1996. And actually, I had 3 lines. I wrote 3 lines, and but they were like from another time. They were not my lines in a way. It was not mystical. They just were in other style. And then I decided to put them into the motto of my poem and to sign them with a Gaustine. I don't know why. I just like this name, Gaustine, because it sounds like Augustine. I liked Augustine, Saint Augustine. And so there were 3 lines, and I tried to translate them. I could read them now. It was the woman who invented the troubadour. I say it again, she invented the inventor. So this was that were the lines by Gaustine. And after that, Gaustine started to appear in all my short stories, poems. Sometimes he's from 13th century, he's troubadour. Sometimes he's my classmate, or he's from 1960s. And actually in the Physics of Sorrow, Gaustine is one of the main characters. And in Time Shelter, he really takes the thing in his hands. He's the really main character. And yeah, Gaustine is this kind of traveler, or not traveler, but flaneur in the times. And he's everything that my limited body and time can't do. Actually, he's again part of this invisible friends that you have, that you keep the whole life.
I think what's interesting about Gaustine is that he's sort of a trickster figure. He always has these get-rich-quick schemes that usually sort of grandiosely flop, but in a relatively humorous way. So it's a...
He have a great project, but yeah, they always have these grandiose flops. Yes, and this project, this is the greatest project of Gaustine with the clinics for the past. And it happened again the same in the end of the book.
Exactly. I think what's interesting about Time Shelter is you play with this idea through the figure of Gaustine of memory. It begins as a method of healing. Gaustine has this clinic. Elderly people with Alzheimer's disease come and they can live comfortably in the happiest decade of their life. They can imagine they're back in their youth with their friends, their family. But little by little throughout the book, it becomes more sinister, the past, and it becomes not just a clinic, but nations of the past. Every nation decides to vote for the decade it would like to go back to, and many sort of destructive nationalist forces are put into motion. So can you talk about the past, the personal past versus the national past, and how those things can be healing and dangerous at the same time?
Honestly speaking, I don't have proper answer. It's the most difficult question now. But as a writer, I really believe in. I like the past. I like to be there, to come there, and to come back, of course. But when we are talking about the nations, the past and reviving of the past could be really dangerous. What we see now, I think in the last years you could see more obviously. This is the revival of the past, the reenactment of the past. This is the using of the past like a paycheck for the future, like in the ideological terms. What I mean, before, our past was full of future. The future was this paycheck. Usually they promise to you that after 20 years, after 30 years, the communism will build, we will fly to the moon or to the Mars or so on. So the future was this check, this big promising. And now things really change, and the past make America, Bulgaria, Poland, Hungary great again. Again, we have this turning point of to the past, and this could be dangerous. That's why it was not easy to write this novel, because, as I said, all my books are dedicated to the past, so they have their sources in my personal past, in my childhood, and now I should put another point of view. This is that past could be a dangerous thing. It could be like lightly poison, like slow poison. There is a discreet charm of the past, but this could be the discreet charm of the monster.
I guess one other figure that gets at this delicate balance between the past and the future is this blind Vaisha. She was based on a short story that you wrote that was turned into a film by Theodore Rushev, which actually was nominated for Academy Award in 2017. And the story of this woman who has one eye on the past and one eye on the future, and she can't see the present. And you talk here in Time Shelter about the diagnosis, the syndrome of blind Vaisha.
Yeah, so this story became a diagnosis now. There is chapters in Time Shelter with a new diagnosis or future diagnosis, and the syndrome of blind Vaisha is one of them, because it's a blindness actually. When you have one eye to the future and another eye to the past, you are blind. And I think that this could be really one of the diagnoses in a close future, because, as I said, when the future is cancelled, you don't have many choices, or many directions.
That's interesting. You heard it here first, the diagnosis of blind Vaishas. Do we want to read another excerpt? And then, so Georgi, you're going to read us another excerpt from Time Shelter.
This is a story about Hilde. And I must say that we're reading for the first time these excerpts in English now.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. So I want to say thank you to Angela for this first translation. Беше истинско откровение да гледам от другата стая през полуоткрехнатата врата как възрастната дама, която дойде с абсолютно безизразно лице, лишено от всякаква емоция, с празен поглед, изведнъж се оживи, като видя големия дървен радиоапарат с изписани на скалата градове и започна да ги чете на глас. Лондон, Будапеща, Варшава, Прага, Тулуза, Милано, Москва, Париж, София, Букурещ. София, каза тя, София. В такива ситуации трябваше деликатно да се приближа, да подхванем разговор, да съм готов да чуя историята, да я окуража да си спомни. Оказа се имигрантка от България. Баща е бил немски инженер, оженил се за българка, живели в хубава къща с двор в някакво село до София, до планината, не помнише вече името. Племенника, и който я беше довел, стоеше до нас и не можеше да повярва, че Леля му говори и се вълнува. Това предполагаме нейния език, български, каза той. За човек, който е мълчал толкова години на един език, тя говореше много добре.
Okay, and now an extended excerpt in English, Hilde. It was a true revelation for me to look through the half-open door into another room to see an elderly woman who had arrived with a completely blank face, devoid of any emotion, with an empty gaze, suddenly come to life when she saw the huge wooden radio with the dial of cities on it and started reading aloud. We were now on the 50s floor. London, Budapest, Warsaw, Prague, Toulouse, Milan, Moscow, Paris, Sofia, Bucharest. Sofia, she said, Sofia. In such situations, my job was to tactfully draw closer, to strike up a conversation, to be ready to hear a story, to encourage her to remember. She turned out to be an immigrant from Bulgaria. Her father had been a German engineer who had married a Bulgarian woman. They lived in a nice house with a yard in some village near Sofia, near the mountain. She couldn't remember the name anymore. Her nephew, who had brought her to the clinic, stood next to us and could not believe that his aunt was speaking and livening up. That's her language, I suppose, Bulgarian, he said. She hadn't spoken it in almost 20 years. For a person who had been silent in a given language for so many years, she spoke very well. Of course, her story was broken up by some blank spots in her memory, in her language, but then it would pick up again in another place. She remembered how in the evenings they would gather around the radio for the music hour. As for the news, only her mother and father listened to it, but they would all listen to the concerts for the soldiers on the fronts and the classical recitals together. She talked about the blinking light on the radio, how she would read out the cities on the dial like a counting rhyme, imagining what the world in every city would be like. I remember doing the same thing as a child, how that dial was my first Europe, and how I thought that every city had a different sound. And if you move the dial, the condenser, you'd hear the sound of the noisy streets of Paris or people arguing in a square in London. Who knows why, but I always imagined that in London there was somebody squabbling. The world was closed, and those city names were the only proof that somewhere out there beyond the fading, the crackling, the deliberate jamming, those cities existed. And in them, some other people with kids were also sitting around their radio. And if I pricked my ears up enough, I could hear what they were saying in the evenings. And the woman kept on talking and talking. And then the radio ordered us, schneller, schneller, we must run. The Russian troops, I was 12, a blue cardigan, rote, buttons, mama, a little bunny here. She pointed at the upper right-hand side of her cardigan. Mama had sewed a Kaninchen there. We have to run. Daddy is German, they'll kill him. And grandma yelled, here, bad, run. Last train and quick airplane shooting. Grrr. Train stops, down, we lied. Grass. A long pause, as if she had lost her train of thought. Grass. Again a pause, then suddenly the memory comes back, swooping over her head like an airplane. Her face is twisted in fear. She raises her arms. Is it possible? I think I know this woman from somewhere. Her nephew hugs her. I'm not sure she even notices him. He is absent from this memory. She is now in 1944. Her language becomes completely broken. German words slip in. Schneller, Achtung. The train is carrying the last German employees, refugees, families. The planes are dropping bombs. The train stopped. They have to jump out and lie on the ground. The scent of soil, bullets around her, her mother's body. She doesn't mention her father, but a cow appears walking towards them. It breaks into a run, stops and looks around and starts again, frightened by the bombs and the shooting. Get out of here, little cow, the woman yells. The girl yells, get out of here, cow, they'll kill you. But the cow doesn't hear, moo, right at the girl. And then a piece of shrapnel, I'm filling in the unclear parts of the story, hits the cow in the rump. She starts bleeding and limping. Moo, moo, moo. The woman moos. Hey, cow, hey, cow. She gets up and starts running towards the cow. Her mother pulls her down sharply and she falls. Where? Moo, moo. Oh, cow, don't die. The cow is lying in front of her, shaking its head. And eyes, it has eyes and cow cry. And the girl woman is saying it's crying, and she's crying. Tante, tante. Her nephew keeps saying in German with all the awkwardness of a person witnessing a taboo scene. Calm down. Do something, he turns to me. She's crying. She's remembering, I say. She's alive. That's why she's crying. I speak English so as not to upset his aunt. Strange sort of therapy you do here, he says through clenched teeth, and I know he will not bring her here again. He might file a complaint or even a lawsuit, who knows. Hilde. All of a sudden the name comes to me. Hilde, I say loudly, grasping the woman's hand. The nephew is stunned. How do you know her name? They're here for the first time. I didn't do her intake registration. She raises her head and looks at me. She won't recognize me. 20 or so years ago, I was sitting in her living room in Frankfurt. My wife and I had stayed at her place for 2 nights. A friend had put us in touch. I wrote something about her back then. Hilde, the woman who saved Germany. She doesn't recognize me. I hold her hand and speak to her in Bulgarian. I tell her that I see that cow. It is now grazing at the right hand of God, because it wasn't alone when it died. It had seen a young girl talking to it. That is a happy death. Other cows now die unhappily, but that one had been embraced, so everything is okay now. She is okay. I realize that I'm not speaking to the elderly woman, but to that 12-year-old girl. As she sits, she quiets down, sits on the sofa, lets her head loll back, and falls asleep.
Thank you for this reading.
Thank you. It's great text. So do we want to take some questions from the audience at this point?
Yeah.
It's about 10 to 11. So great. So Georgi is going to pick some questions out of the Q&A.
Yes, so please use the Q&A to ask your questions. I think there is one question, and there is just one comment in the chat. I think that was referring to Georgi's conversation. And it says, Borges also writes a fiction that humanizes the Minotaur.
So we have 2 questions. What is it that Bulgaria didn't have, and what draws you to the magical realism presented in your books? I don't know if it's magical realism, but I must say yes. If I should say or list 3 names of the authors that really influenced me, I would say Borges, Marquez, and my grandma. In Bulgarian, all of them are with B. No, Borges, Marquez, and Baba. You know, it started with my grandma, actually. When I was a child and I used to live with my grandma, I had all these stories. You should see, you should hear how Bulgarians tell their stories, so old Bulgarians, our grandparents. We were from generation that used to live with their grandparents because our parents, they missed, in a way, they worked, they were in the cities. And it was something specific trauma for all of my generation. And all these stories that I heard from my grandmother and my grandfather, they were really important for me. Yeah. And I always will mention them. But also Borges and Marquez. This is something that, yeah, maybe was important for my writing. I still remember the beginning of the 100 Years Solitude by Marquez, this beautiful long opening sentence. What is it that Bulgaria didn't have? This is, I don't know if this word exists at all in English, unhappened, but this is something that never happened. And this is the most important part of the personal and national story and history, I think, for Bulgarians. What's not happened? This is the dream of my mother and father to visit Paris, let's say, or to my grandmother who never left her village. And she was jealous about my grandfather because my grandfather visited half of Europe. Half of Europe was Hungary and Yugoslavia during the Second World War. But anyway, it was traveling. So this was one of the traumas that we should talk about them, this abandoned, this denied world, this unhappened world for several generations. Victoria, my question is, what does this therapeutic method of remembering mean to you? Do you think memory can heal? Yes, there is this kind of therapy, this retroactive therapy with memory, actually. And what's the idea? The idea is that when you have this Alzheimer's disease or other memory loss, you lose your short memory and you're going back to your early years. You remember what happened when you were 17, 18 years old, but you don't remember what was yesterday. And so the idea of this Gaustin's rooms for past is that you could synchronize the internal time of the patient with the time that you simulate in the rooms. If in your body, in your mind, you're living in 1968, it will be good to have a room that is also settled in 1968, to have this synchrony between your internal time and the big time, and the historical time. That's the idea, and of course it's exaggerated in the novel, and after that Gaustin want to have the whole city settled in one decade, or the whole country, the whole continent, and yes, but we will keep this spoilers.
Great. Are there other questions or?
Not yet.
Okay. So one of the figures that I thought was interesting in Time Shelter that kind of ties into this last question was this figure of Dembi. And you call him a dealer of the past, almost like a drug dealer, weapons dealer, but he deals in the past, and he has this extras for revolutions. And although this is an exaggeration, I think there are parallels in current political culture.
I'm quite sure that this job maybe illegally exists in Bulgaria, to be dealer of the past. Or to
I can think of a few individuals who might have that on their business card. Yeah.
So Dembi is like a double of Gaustin, but more dark double and trickster and a bit tragicomic double of Gaustin. He organized, he's managing all this past, all these reenactments actually. And he made the two, because in the novel for Bulgaria, you have the movement of DSE, which means movement for late socialism, and another movement which is nationalistic. And actually this dealer of the past, he's working with both movements. He could sell the past to both of them. He could make reenactments with both of them. That's Dembi. He's, a quite funny character. And of course, the prototype is a friend of mine from my childhood. And I will stop. I will not tell the stories.
Okay.
Question to you.
To me. Okay. Aside from the purely grammatical differences between Bulgarian and English languages, what are the biggest challenges when translating from Bulgarian, and specifically when translating the works of GEORGI GOSPODINOV? I'd say, basically, I mean, the realia of socialism is so difficult, especially in GEORGI's work, but this is something you find with many contemporary Bulgarian authors. Socialism and sort of the socialist past is a theme, and it's just, we don't, as Americans, and I think generally as English speakers, we don't have anything equivalent that we've lived through. And what's so interesting about socialism is that a lot of the socialists speak is sort of, the meaning is in its meaninglessness. It has these highfalutin statements about the bright future. And when you translate them literally, it's just nonsense. It's this sort of, but that nonsense has a very specific meaning, and any Bulgarian will immediately identify that as socialist speak. And so it's really, you want to keep this idea of the sort of pomposity of the socialist discourse, but also make it something that's not going to sound like a bad translation or just gibberish. So that's really difficult about GEORGI's work in particular. There's so many little things, about socialism that, we had a really kind of fun time in Physics of Sorrow. What is revané? It's this dessert that's kind of made of like, it's, one of the typical sort of former Ottoman Empire desserts that's poured with this, syrup on the top, but it's not baklava. It's sort of more like bread.
And it was nickname of one of the characters.
It was a nickname of one of the characters, yeah. So there's these little things that any Bulgarian of GEORGI's generation would know immediately and have a lot of personal, connotations with, but there's, nothing that's going to help an English reader.
The deficit gave us this collective memory. We have this common memory for about the same things, because you don't have many
types of
that you would taste. Revané was one of them.
Exactly. And so I think also, Bulgaria has such the past is so present in Bulgaria, even now. And, what Russian sounds like to a Bulgarian and why it sounds that way is very important. And that's hard because we don't have that kind of historical relationship with Russia, in English, or what Serbian is going to sound like, or what, a village dialect is going to sound like. It's Bulgaria. There's so many layers of language that don't have a direct equivalent in American English that make it really challenging.
What about Turkish words also?
Turkish words, which are often the most colorful, funny, that really give a flavor to contemporary Bulgarian, that, in English you have to try hard, use a lot of non-colloquial, sort of idioms to try and get that same sort of colloquial, slightly facetious, tongue-in-cheek flavor that Turkish words bring to Bulgarian.
I don't see other. Okay, we have a question. It's a very good question. Literature has been used as an instrument to understand and find meaning in the past, the present, and the future. Where do you think it works best? In the past, of course. In the past. Of course, that there is a big, huge, spectrum of literature that is dedicated to the future. And personally, I don't like this one. I'm not dedicated to the future at all. I don't believe that, I don't believe that actually, let's say, I wrote in different genres, and maybe I failed in different genres, but I had one attempt for libretto for opera. And this is, the name is space opera. And this is maybe the only thing that is dedicated to the future. It's about the first spaceship to Mars. And when I wrote it, I realized that I don't believe that Mars will decide our troubles here in the Earth. I don't believe that if you are fighting in the kitchens, if you travel to Mars, you will leave your kitchens on the Earth. You will travel just with your kitchens and with your scandals and with everything. So, of course, but for the literature, thank you for this good question. I really think that literature is feel more comfortably in the past, because the past is full of stories. The future is empty of stories, so you should invent it. but the past is really, really full of stories. And here in Bulgaria, on the Balkans, we have a huge amount of untold stories. So it's not bad to be a writer in Bulgaria. Yeah.
A dealer of the past, as it were.
A dealer of the past, yeah.
So Milena, give us a sign. Do we have time for more questions?
So I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions maximum. And there is one that was posted in the chat. So if you want to jump on this one, it's about the Bulgarian children scattered around the world today. How do they relate to Bulgaria?
Bulgarian children scattered around the world. Bulgarian kids who are growing up somewhere like in the US or in Australia or in London, Paris.
Bulgarian children.
Yes, yeah.
How they relate to Bulgaria through the stories being told by their parents, I believe that's the question.
I'm not sure if I take the question. Could you tell me Bulgaria?
Български деца, които вече живеят извън България, се израснали извън България, как реагират на тези истории за България, за техните родители?
Okay, thank you, Chad, for this question. Yeah, when I have my readings outside in Europe mainly, but also in US, I meet some of these Bulgarian kids. Now they are maybe 18, 20 years old. And, you know, what was surprising to me, they really have curiosity to the stories, especially written in The Physics of Sorrow. Because when I finished The Physics of Sorrow, I thought that all these stories, they are for my generation. But actually, I think that the young people had more curiosity. And I asked them, why? And they told me, because they are stories of our parents. Mm-hmm. And because, you know, it was a problem for my generation. We never talked easily with our parents. We never had these free talks with them. And these kids and young persons, they told me that this problem still exists in a way. So they listen to these stories. I'm joking that maybe they read Physics of Sorrow like a historical novel, because this is from the 20th century. Could you imagine 20th century? But no, they have this curiosity, and I really like to meet these young people abroad. And once they told me, you are writing about the Bulgarian, complex of the denied world. Mm-hmm. And your generation really want to travel abroad because you were forbidden to travel abroad before. So this is a kind of compensation of the deficit. They explained me this. And but for us, they told me, it's in opposite way. Because for us, it's so easy to travel abroad, we are living abroad, and for us, the big trauma is Bulgaria. It's we want to travel back to Bulgaria. We want to be there, to stay there. And yeah, I really like these guys. Mm-hmm. And yeah, finally, because I promised to tell the story about the beginning of my writing, yes. The second story. It's a very funny story and a bit ironic. So the first thing that I read about writers was written on the blue plastic sign in a snack bar in our neighborhood, in a very dirty snack bar. You could imagine this square tables,
plastic chairs,
chairs, and this plastic blue sign, and what was written on the sign, I still remember clearly. Writers are surgeons of the human soul. They must cut out all that is rotten and decayed. And could you imagine every morning with my father, we have this tripe soup and lemonade, and with every spoonful, I have this rotten, decayed surgeons. So I really started to hate writers at the beginning, from the very beginning, because I imagined them as surgeons with the white gloves, with a big scalpel, and I couldn't imagine where is the soul among the internal organs, but it was such a terrible thing. And I think I promised to myself that I will never be a surgeon of the human soul. This was my first memory.
Wow, Yambo
writers in Yambo.
In Yambo, wow. I think there's a reason that so many interesting literary figures have come from there. Milena's from there, Svetlana's from there, you're from there, Hristo Stoyanov. So there's something in the air there in the snack bar.
But there were only first shift workers in this snack bar every morning, not writers at all, not intellectuals. I don't know which ideological mind decided to put this sign there. So this is the story. And maybe now it's time to present Peter Slavov.
Absolutely, yeah.
I want to say hi also to him, Peter. Yeah.
Hi.
Say great thank you for your In Defense of the Minotaur. And yeah, we will listen your music now.
Before that, actually, let me introduce Peter Slavo for those who might not heard his amazing performances here, mostly in New York pre-COVID. So New York-based, Bulgarian-born and Grammy-nominated double bassist, composer, and educator as well. After graduating Berklee College in the US, he has performed with acclaimed musicians and artists such as John Lovano, Quincy Jones, among others, in institutions such as the Lincoln Center and many other places in the vibrant New York jazz scene. So welcome everybody to this jazz matinee. Actually, put on your headphones or speakers, and yeah, Peter, can you tell a little bit before about the pieces you're gonna perform for us? Thank you.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm very happy to be here. I mean, very happy to be a part of this. Not particularly happy to be in a bedroom in Queens, but this is the COVID reality. So I recorded shot two bass pieces for you. There is a serious literary connection when it comes to my original music, and as Georgi mentioned and Milena mentioned, that there is a piece on my latest album called "In Defense of the Minotaur," which piece was inspired by the writings of Georgi Gospodinov. Today, I'm not going to be able to perform that for you because it requires a band, and yeah, I couldn't fit a band in here. So I will. I've prepared the first piece is that you're going to hear. Well, first of all, if you can, make sure you have headphones on or decent speakers, because I play the bass, the upright bass, and due to its like low frequencies, if you listen to it on a small like phone or laptop speaker, you're only gonna get like a half of the of the experience. And then the pieces I prepared, the first one is called Elegy, and it's also on my record, and it involves a few different techniques that I've worked on through the years when it comes to improvising without a band. So there's a few different like percussive techniques, and also it's a semi-improvised piece, which means that there is a premeditated motif that happens, and then I try to kind of like compose real time in that in that vein. And so here we go.
Wow, thank you. This time we really showed. Thank you for bearing with us. Actually, um, we were really at the mercy of internet bandwidth. Peter, can you introduce the second piece, and I'll share it again. I'm sorry you cannot hear it the way I can hear it. It's just the sound, the quality of sound is getting lost.
Okay, yeah, sorry about that technical mishap. I I don't know exactly what happened, and I realized that the visual is not the same without the music. But the second piece that you're gonna see and hear was more of an improvised thing that grew into an actual tune that it's a Jimi Hendrix tune, actually. It just went there. You know, sometimes when we improvise, we rely on familiar pieces and that we put together, and sometimes things go a certain way. So I don't know if subconsciously inspired by current events, but I started as an improvisation, and it went into Hey Joe by Jimi Hendrix. So enjoy.
Can you see my screen well?
Yes.
4:30 p.m. here in New York, and I would like to welcome the poet, American poet and poet laureate Linda Gregerson and NADYA Radulova, award-winning Bulgarian translator as well, and a poet. This is another magnificent, wondrous literary connection and partnership and friendship that Linda and NADYA develop, and I will give the floor to them so you can actually enjoy the conversation and their work.
Hello, everybody. Dobar večer od Sofia. Good evening from Sofia. It's almost midnight here, and I'm very honored to be invited to this event. I'm sitting in my little daughter's bedroom now. You can see parts of her world in the background. But I'm so happy to stay awake an hour or two with you on this really very important bridge of hospitality over this very troubled water of hostility that we face nowadays globally. And I'm glad and thankful to be here with Linda Gregerson, who is renowned contemporary American poet, who's a distinguished professor of Renaissance literature, who's a great mentor of many aspiring young poets in America, and who's also a really very nice and kind and caring person and a good friend of mine. Thank you, Linda, that we are together again, though.
Always.
So, yeah. Several words about Milena already mentioned how we met, but you can guess that for a person that has never been to the States, as my case is, it's such a rare and precious opportunity to meet a person as Linda. And this rare chance I owe to Elizabeth Kosovo Foundation, and particularly to Elizabeth and Milena and Simona. Thank you. That you brought in 2015 in Bulgaria, in the small town of Koprivnica, several prominent American poets and British poets and Bulgarian poets for a poetry conference. I was there invited as a member of the team of the translators. And the first time I heard Linda reciting, reading her poems, I was dazzled, and it was as like a love from the first sight. So I was absolutely determined to bring her works into Bulgarian to translate them. And she's really a generous person who, without knowing me at that time, said yes. So I was lucky to have her agreement, and I started searching for a publisher in Bulgaria who to publish the book. It's not an easy thing to find a publishing house ready to work with poetry and American poetry, contemporary. So here, another friend helped a lot. Writer and journalist Sylvia Choleva, who runs a small but high quality publishing house for international poetry, agreed to publish this book. And yeah, I started translating. I worked maybe for a year and something. Linda was all the time present. She helped a lot, answering all my questions, and really patient with all the things I wanted to ask her. Then another friend, Dimitar Kenarov, edited the translation. So it was, the whole thing was an affair of friendship, actually. And at the end, another friend, the talented Bulgarian artist, Nadezhda Oleklahova, made the design of the cover and the whole book. So in 2018, this beautiful book, Bulgarian, with the translations of Linda Gregerson, Machines for Breathing, was published. And I would like to start, my first questions will be related to this Bulgarian book and to its ending pages, actually. The book ends with a small rubric, which is a poet's dictionary. It's published in each edition of this publishing house's books. And it usually asks the authors in translation to provide definitions for key concepts, key terms. So one of the words that had to be defined in this poet's dictionary was the word American, or being American. And what Linda answered to this question in 2018 was that being American for her is, I quote, to be ashamed of the country I love. So I would like to ask you, Linda, now, if you were given a second chance today, would you change this definition? Times changed a bit, so yeah, I have to ask this question.
Thank you, Nadia. And let me, before I answer that question, which is, of course, the question, and a piercing one these days, I also want to express my enormous gratitude to the Elizabeth Kostova Foundation, to Milena and Elizabeth personally, and to the angels who sent me this unbelievable translator and friend, Nadia Radulova. I don't deserve her. She's magnificent. She's brilliant. She is a gifted, gifted poet herself. And the conversations we had when she was working on the translations of these poems were like, if seminars had died and gone to heaven, that's what they would be. They were just thrilling, thrilling exchanges about poetry, about language, about nuanced meaning, about cultures, and it's really been the privilege of a lifetime. Thank you, my dear. American. I am afraid that this country, which I passionately love, filled with people I passionately love, has given us all yet more cause to be profoundly ashamed in the past few years. It's really been a wound to the soul. And 4 years ago, everyone I knew after that election was in tears and traumatized. It's been a very, very bad, very dark time for us and for the world, upon which we visit all our pathologies and arrogance and errors and narcissism and ignorance. That sounds very, very harsh, but I think one can only be harsh when the one you love, in this case, this country, goes so desperately awry. I am guardedly optimistic that beginning on January 20th, we will become somewhat more responsible toward one another, toward the world and the other people in it, toward the earth, which we have done more than our share to destroy. I think the pivot, talking in large categorical terms, very, very quickly becomes specious. So I won't do more of that, except to say that, you know, when I travel outside the States, and especially in the past 4 years, I have felt whenever I meet anyone, as though I should first get down on my knees and say how very, very, very sorry I am. And that I hope they will understand not all of us are pleased. We talked, Nadia and I, about a poem that might give us an opportunity to talk to you about some of the issues we faced in translation. And this particular poem is one that also is a sort of love poem to my country. And it's a Love in Grieving poem, but it was written at a time of much more hopefulness, much more optimism. It was written in the wake of another election in 2012, when Barack Obama was elected to the presidency of our country. And many of us had been deeply invested in that election. Wonderful numbers of young people had who hadn't even been able to, hadn't been old enough to vote in prior elections, had gone out to work, to canvass. They'd taken buses and gone to the countryside to knock on doors, to hand out information, to ask if people needed help getting to the polls, if they had any questions and so forth. And also to canvass in the sense of, you know, taking the temperature of the country and coming to and trying to understand what people were thinking and feeling and hoping for from the election. So I wrote a poem that I thought was going to be a very contained poem, which made me pleased because my poems don't stay short enough sometimes, or as short as I would like them to be. I quite envy people who can write briefer poems. And this was based on a story my daughter told me that had been told to her by a friend who had been canvassing for Barack Obama in North Carolina. This is a sort of, you'll hear, it's a persona poem. It's written in a voice that is not altogether my own. The poem is called The Selvage. 1. So door to door, among the shotgun shacks in Cullowhee and Waynesville in our cleanest shirts, and ma'am, excuse me, we're all but second nature now. And this one woman comes to the door. She must have weighed 300 pounds. Would you be willing to tell us who you plan to vote for, we say. And she turns around with Everett. Who we voting for? The black guy, says Everett. The black guy, she says, except that wasn't the language they used. They used the word we've all agreed to banish from even our innermost thoughts, which is when I knew he was going to win. When I wrote that, I thought, that's it. 4 stanzas, and I finished the poem. And I went away from my desk pleased. And when I came back to my desk the next morning and looked at it, I was devastated to discover how very far it was from being a poem I could let stand like that. I had thought the story was one of hopefulness and looking forward with good cheer to a shared future. And I realized, of course, that the voice I'd allowed to speak in this poem, which isn't me alone, was far from being the voice of hope, was the voice of condescension, and therefore was a symptom of exactly what is wrong with this country and what we've been suffering from. I looked at it and kind of thought again in horror that here is someone speaking and saying, look, if even these people who live way out in the boondocks, away from everything, who, you know, don't know how to eat properly and aren't liberated enough to know that women are supposed to speak for themselves rather than asking their husbands who they're voting for, and, you know, even people like this are going to vote for the person I know to be the right one, things are going to be okay. And I thought, God, that's a mortifying self-exposure. That's deeply, deeply wrong. So I had to write forward, and I wrote a second section, 2, also based on a real event and story. In this instance, one told to me by my sister. 2, at which point the speaker discovers, as if the lesson were new, she has told the story at her own expense. Amazing, said my sister's chairman's second wife, to think what you've amounted to considering where you're from, which she imagined was a compliment. One country, friend, where when we have to go there, is depend upon it fat or thin, regenerate or blinkered to the end, we shall, they have to take us in. So there I had done my bit of penance, confessing to discovered sin. But the poem could not just be a two-part. It couldn't be mistake and then, oh, now I've saved it. Not least because there is so much wrong with part two as a straightforward answer somehow to part one. For one thing, it's self-justifying in a certain way. It's, see, I've suffered from condescension too. And see, I'm flashing my working class credentials. And so it just, you know, it was something, I think it needed to stand, but it wasn't enough. And where I had to go next, I didn't know. I just knew it had to be elsewhere, and it had to be something that was wiser than I am. That's a very difficult place when one is composing a poem. I get to it often, that sort of cliff's edge where I know I've got to go someplace, but I don't know where it is, and it's really painful, and I try 10,000 things and they're all wrong. And then I had a visitation. I was driving on a little, near a one-lane bridge that leads to my house here in Michigan, and saw an extraordinary vision, really, of Canadian geese who were meant to be migrating. I was afraid they'd been stalled here too long in the season, you know, the climate's changing, all these things happen, and the river was freezing over, that they had found a portion that was still unfrozen. And there were more than I could believe. And so I both worried for them and was amazed. So I wrote on. Regenerate or blinkered to the end we shall, they have to take us in. I saw three. A river full of geese as I drove home across our one-lane bridge. 400 of them easily, close massed against the current and the bitter wind. Some settled on the ice, and just the few at a time who'd loosen rank to gather again downstream, as if to paraphrase. The fabric every minute bound by just that pulling out that holds the reveling together. You were driving all this time, said Stephen, counting geese. The snow falling into the river. No, the river about to give itself over to ice. I'd stopped. Their wingspan, had they not been taking shelter here, as wide as we are tall. And what the geese really came to tell me what this poem had been meaning to be about all along, that we're all here on sufferance. We are all here on sufferance. And that our foothold or our waterhold or our wing hold here is very precarious indeed. It was, of course, a time then, as it is now, of mass global trauma and mass migration. The last time the UN Refugee Agency publishes at the end of every calendar year the best statistics they've been able to assemble about forced migration in the world. And so the last time they published it was almost a year ago. It was December 2019. And at that time, they estimated that there were 79.5 million people who had been forced from their homes by war, hunger, climate change or poverty. One in one, let me make sure I get this right, 1%, more than 1% of all the human beings on Earth. When they publish their updated statistics next month, surely it will not be any better. And we have just begun to see the results, the displacement of human beings due to climate change. We are all at the mercy of the hospitality of this earth. And we have done much to trigger its hostility. So I think that, you know, it goes back to being an American, that my country is a country of displaced people, including those who inhabited this land before Europeans came here. Those Native Americans have been displaced by what we now call settler colonialism. The rest of us have come from different parts of the earth. My grandparents all came from poverty in Norway and were very, very grateful to this country for giving them a home. It is one of the terrible ironies of history that this country of displaced persons sees repeated waves of hostility to those who wish to come here now. It's not something I write about endlessly, but it's something that I am increasingly aware of daily, both how unearned my own good fortune is and how much I owe to the world of people, to those who haven't been this lucky. I guess it's part of the reason I write poems. Much good may they do.
Thank you for choosing this poem and for introducing it in this way and for this meta position, your reflection upon it, and the ethical position that you actually revealed in it. I don't know if you know, actually, this is something that we never discussed, I think, but this was the first poem I translated. And yes. And I will not talk about these little minor problems about translating untranslatable realias, like, for example, the shotgun shacks, something really, really American. But this was my first meeting as a translator with your writing style, with all these breaking of the syntax, of the lineation, with these intertwining of family narratives with political kind of statements and big ethical problems, and also with this asymmetry that you say in one interview that you're wedded to. So while speaking now about your writing style, I can't avoid the question of one very particular metaphor in this poem, which is very important, and it's not just important for this poem, but I think for all your works, and it's not accidentally that you have a whole book which is called The Salvage. In the third part, in the part which is full of geese, with these migrating geese, you have, I'll read just the quote. The fabric animated bound by just that pulling out that holds the raveling together. And my question is, do you think, Linda, that this metaphor of salvage, of the unraveling salvage, could describe your individual way of writing? your way unique to imagine the language, to craft the language. So it should be more apt to express our fragile, broken, vulnerable human condition.
That's a great question, Nadia. Thank you. Salvage, if for any of you who are still uncertain what it means, and for whom my poem was insufficient explanation, it's the edge of when fabric is sold in bolts. Well, is manufactured and shipped and stored and sold from a bolt. There's a part that's a raw edge. And when you cut off yardage, you've got two raw edges. Say I want 3 yards of fabric. The beginning and end of that are going to be raw edges prone to unraveling. But the sides are self-bound. Excuse me, I'm going to drink a little water. The sides are self-bound, self-edged. And it's that weaving against itself. Well, weaving itself, of course, is a tension of oppositions. It's what constitutes a fabric. And so I think, you know, I haven't thought of it strictly in terms of my writing style or method, but I actually think, but in some ways, Nadia, you would be in a better position to know and observe. And I think you're right. Excuse me a minute. I like disruption. I like to be open to it. I like a poem to be open to other voices barging in, ones that aren't quite my own, to inconsistent pitches of diction, and to, as you point out, interruptions, parentheticals, discontinuity, and so forth. I also, thinking of that wonderful musical interlude that we had half an hour ago, I also think of it as a musical proposition, speedings up and slowings down, and dynamic differentiations. If there's a selvage, if there's an equivalent of selvage in poems as I experience them while I'm writing them, it is, maybe there are 2 kinds. One is syntax itself, that there's a forward momentum, and even when it's disrupted or deferred or resisted, it's a form of expectation, a form of, well, stitching the past to the future. That is what perhaps is the thing perhaps I'm most conscious of when I'm writing a poem. That and a rhythm, sort of a rough, a sprung meter. And the other thing that might constitute the selvage, might make something that would otherwise be scattered whole, is voice, is a recognizably, which I hope is a recognizably human voice, however much it may be constituted by overheard pieces of language, borrowed pieces of language, language encountered in bureaucratic documents or the newspaper or on a commuter bus. Still, I want there to be enough of a through line that the reader can imagine as me. So that there's that grounding, however discontinuous, but at grounding to refer to. to keep it from spinning apart. Thank you again for that question.
You're so, I mean, you know a lot about what you're doing. I mean, you're really reflecting on the form very much. All the time while I was translating your poems, I was a bit nervous about the fact how you feel seeing your poems traveling from the one bank to the other bank and not exactly knowing what's happening with them. When thinking about the role of the translator in this situation, it reminds me of a mathematical problem. It's part of the recreational maths, and it's about the farmer and the boatman who had to carry through the river a goat, a wolf, and a cabbage, but he couldn't take the three all together. He had to carry them one by one in the boat, and he couldn't leave neither the wolf and the goat unattended, nor the cabbage and the goat. And at the same time, eventually they had to reach the other bank intact. So the translator is in the same very confused position, trying to preserve at the same time the form and the meaning, not to sacrifice either of them, and at the same time to try to preserve this zest of foreignness, which actually makes the poem its author's poem, not its translator's poem. This is, of course, quite a European concept of translation, but still I wonder how you felt while your poems were in this process of transition. Blanchot calls it actually text in transition when originally written text passes through this translating process, but he has this idea that every piece of literature is unfinished and incomplete and unstable, and it reaches its completion through its translations. What do you think about this? I know it's very European. I know that American school of translation is a bit different, or at least it was. So I wonder about what you think about that.
Well, certainly the proposition about literature in general, that it is unstable, incomplete, and whether it's translated or not, the production of meaning, certainly, let's just leave it limited to make it manageable, but so let's say literary language, or let's say a poem. let's be even more specific. That it's not what it is changes from reading to reading, from reader to reader, and from time to time. It doesn't mean there's no skeletal structure there. It doesn't mean it's amorphous, but it does mean that it is always subject to the collaborative, imaginative response of the one who is reading. So perhaps when a poem is in translation, it's, you know, we've got a triangular relationship, which is a good thing. So as to how I felt, basically thrilled and honored because you're so fabulous and because every question you asked me was so based on such a deep engagement with the poem and with the nuance of being at home in language and being not yet at home.
Not yet at home. Oh, yeah. I mean, this is a
so, I mean, as
strange
to
thing.
This, your metaphor about the sort of river and the boat, and I mean, I don't get to land on the other side of the river because I am such an ignoramus. I speak to this day no Bulgarian, despite the fact that Nadia's beautiful young daughter has been trying to teach me how to count in Bulgarian. She can't believe how inept I am. But I cannot imagine feeling more confident about what to me has to be a sort of dark or opaque side of the river, more confident than I have been in your hands. And again, the conversations we had themselves were so fulfilling, so were meaning making. And for that, here I think we once again need to tip our hats and and bow to Elizabeth Kostova and her marvelous foundation to make these encounters, these conversations, these friendships, these extended, intimate friendships across languages and across cultures possible. I think it's the only future humanity really has, and terribly urgent, very much needed.
Yeah. One more question.
Yes, of course.
We didn't use already existing title for the Bulgarian edition. We used another one. We took it from your text, of course, but the literal translation back to English is Machines for Breathing. And of course, it's very much related to not only to the topic, to some of the topics of your poetry, but again, it's inspired by the very way of writing. 3 years after that, 3 years after this translation happened into Bulgaria, the word breathe is becoming more and more important and more frequently used, not only in our homes, but from the TV screen. We hear it every day. We hear it in the emergency rooms, in the intensive care units. We read it in these terrible transcripts from the racist killing of George Floyd. More than 25 times he repeated, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." And this reminded me of another case you told me about, and another poem you mentioned when you were in Bulgaria, the poem of Gay Ross, about another racist killing several years ago in America, the killing of Eric Garner, I think it was the name of this man who was victim of police brutality. So do you think there is a way to learn to breathe better? Not a medical way, some other way to learn this? It's a bit of a metaphorical question, but
no, it's one, and of course it is now. It's a very charged word and a charged concept in the world, but especially in America. I should say, breathing. I'm happier and happier with, and it was your suggestion, the title for this book in Bulgarian. Breathing has always been an issue for me, one I haven't been able to take for granted because I'm a lifelong asthmatic. And I remember as a little child going when I was going to sleep at night, when I was very little, lying in bed, and I would be wheezing. But what I heard that, the different sort of threads of breath that constitute a wheeze. I imagined that it was a village of people inside my chest, and they were all crying out. They were all crying out for help. And I think we are all crying out for help. I still sometimes, when I wake in the morning and I find myself breathing easily, which I do for the most part now. Modern medicine has been very good to me. But I still think, isn't this amazing look. I'm breathing in, I'm breathing out. It's easy. We, in so many ways, have been stealing one another's breath. And the fact that the atmosphere in which we have to breathe is shared. It's one shared vessel, I think, is something we have to keep in mind, we need to grant one another breathing room, and it's becoming more and more rare and more precious. Now, Nadia, you, as Milena also mentioned, are a very accomplished poet in your own right. You couldn't do the kind of translation you do were that not the case. And I'd like to ask you, please, to read one of your poems. The one we've thought about is a marvelous poem called The Fourth Ditch. And in its epigraph indicates that it is after Dante, Eliot, and Dylan Thomas. Would you read it, please?
Yeah, The Fourth Ditch, after Dante, Eliot, Dylan Thomas. And all the living took up arms against death. They refused to rent out their bodies to sleep, or lend them briefly to an afternoon of dying, or to the longer lustful dying, in the field where stone pines cast their calligraphic shadows, and where birds fly by, and lizards slither, omens fall of rain, disease, regrets. And all the living took up arms against death, believing they could put a stop with impunity to age and rot, not by hands of priests or prophets, but by those which, terrified of how death grows bigger, clip their nails, scrub their heels, and each day excrete pieces of their moribund insides, or mow the long grass round their garden beds. And all the living took up arms against death. The typist comes back home a little after 5. The house agent's clerk arrives. Their stiff backs catch the morsels of the setting sun, but they're also quenched in the tin can open on the table. Then comes the basin, the faucet, which washes off the sticky muck, slowly dripping when all is done and said. And all the living took up arms against death. What would future generations look like, born from fungus at the bottom of the basin, not bigger than a cuckoo's egg, or the lichen on the skin, the last and distant memory of vegetation, kids of ferrous or non-ferrous metals, kids of copper, miles of pliant copper waiting to be smelted. What would future generations look like instead? And all the living took up arms against death. While I stand on this side of the door and watch them, neither man nor woman, my wrinkled digs pour forth not tears, but sticks and thumbs. Twined snakes crawl out of me and coil their wet braids round my burning voice, and bite, but can't get out. Waste lies the land, and broken is the object gifted with a breath. And all the living took up arms against death. The translation is made by my wonderful translator into English who lives in Boston, Maria Vasilyeva, and is edited again by Dmitry Kenarov. We are also a stable translator-editor couple with him. Yeah, thank you, Linda. Thank you for choosing this poem. Actually, you chose it.
I adore this poem. I mean, I love it, and I wanted to ask you about one of the things I mean, I just respond to sort of somatically almost before I respond intellectually are those reiterations, the refrain, and the layering. And then it starts, to reward memory and specifically literary memory. That layered presence of earlier work, and the refrains, those cyclic returns, give the poem a really powerful ceremonial feel. And I wanted to ask you about that, since so many of us do not write in traditional form anymore. It's not the given. And since poetry is not, as it once was, or has sometimes been, part of specifically religious practice, what's your sense of the place of the ceremonial or ritual in lyric poetry now in 2020?
Actually, yeah, the presence, and it's really audible. The presence of Eliot Dante and Dylan Thomas in this text is important, and I tried to their voices in a way to be heard in this poem, as if to amplify the reader's experience with it. So while reading, the reader to also to hear these canonical voices that we actually, Dylan Thomas' voice, we know how he recites with this prophetic intonation. We also heard T.S. Eliot reciting his Wasteland. So it's not something that it's not imaginable. On the other hand, the poem was, I was commissioned to write it for a special event. Several years ago, there was a poetic reading organized in the basement of the Sofia University. It's a wonderful, architecturally wonderful space called The Egg. The very idea that the inferno might start from an egg is quite an interesting one. So we were invited to write poems based on the different infernal circle in Dante's version of the Inferno, and I was kindly invited to visit and examine the 8th circle and to choose some piece of it. So I chose this 4th ditch. And the idea that I wrote this poem to be read aloud also gives some ritual, some ceremonial sense. I think that it's made me go back to the roots of the poetry, where it's not written but pronounced or sung. And it's an important experience. It's important not to forget this, because reading aloud a poem really makes us a community and blurs the border between the reader and the listener. We are all part of the poetry. We live our individualities. And yeah, poets write not only with their brains and their hands, but with their voices as well. And we shouldn't forget that. Yeah.
So I love I love the story of that commission, and it makes me think about presence and the sort of our presence together. Now here we are gathered virtually. You were able, for that purposes of that commission, blessedly still to gather in a single architectural space and to be revisiting together the remembered architecture of Dante's Inferno. For him, it was a sense-making cosmology. The 4th ditch in particular, and I had to, as you know, I had to go back and look it up again. The 4th ditch in the 8th circle is the circle of fraud in Dante's Hell.
Yeah.
And the ditch is reserved, the 4th ditch is reserved for soothsayers, which kind of baffled me. And I then looked at the individual, the sufferers, the damned in this ditch, have their heads turned backward on their shoulders. And I was trying to think about what made that, what constituted that sin. And they seem to be those who, their version of fraud consists in a specious, a false, a wrong-headed, as it were, attempt to read or to control the future. And I wanted to know how that ditch informed the development of this poem, and your revisiting of these canonical poets, these canonical Anglophone. I mean, not obviously Dante didn't write in English, the Italian, but non-Bulgarian, so Italian and Anglophone poets. What is it about that fourth ditch?
Yeah, it's maybe one of the worst places in Dante's Inferno. It's called Male Boat, and in translation, it means the evil ditches. And these fortune tellers and sorcerers and seers and people who try to mess around with God's plan and to change his plan and to change the future. This is really something that is so harshly punished with this breaking of their necks, in fact. But in my poem, actually, to some extent, ironically, I put all of us, all of contemporary people in this fourth ditch as not sorcerers, but people who try to mess around with God's plan. And not because we are trying to postpone death or to prolong our lives, but more because we invest so much, so massively in our bodies, turning our bodies into a site of cult. And while for thousands of years our civilization was somehow functioning on the presumption that soul is the thing that guarantees our immortality, nowadays soul can be easily extracted like a diseased tooth, and we armor the body with all these medicines and nano technologies and all this high-tech stuff in order to make it immortal. There is this Israeli writer, best-selling one, who writes about that. His book Homo Deus. This is Yuval Noah Harari, actually. So in his books, he says that this is the end of the human as we know him, and what is approaching this Homo Deus, who is an AI and who is practically immortal. But I'm quite skeptical about that, and especially when we talk about art. There is a wonderful, magnificent letter by one of my favorite musicians and poets, the Dark Bards, Nick Cave, who wrote a letter to one of his fans, but actually it was a letter to Harari, where Nick Cave says that, yeah, probably the AI really can make a revolution in different branches of, in all branches practically of our life, but he won't be able, an AI won't be able to write a great song or a great poem, because what makes a work of art great is this sense of awe, and the sense of awe is based precisely on our limited human potential and on our audacity and nerve and boldness to reach beyond our potential. So maybe the AI would become a great crafter, but not a great artist. Or the great artist is Icarus. The great artist flies, dared to fly, and then fail and then falls. So art is about our flying and falling and failure and our fragility as human beings presupposes that. Maybe if you ask me in 100 years, I say something different, but now this is what I think. Ask me again.
No, it's very moving, and you know the notion that art, that resonance, that genuine resonance or soul is constituted in the face of constraint, of limit. And I think that has a special meaning for poets who choose to encounter, to devise, if they don't entirely inherit, formal constraint, something that resists the will and the wish to somehow be unlimited. I think we should turn to some questions, and I think
there are no questions. There is, I think, a question in the chat.
There is one question is in
the
chat. Yes, it's whether you think that the sense of belonging and the search for a home is at the core of humanity. And I believe this is a question for you, Nadia, because the person asked the question made the conclusion that it feels like that your translation is a true hospitality offered from one artist to another.
Sorry, is this the question?
It's a question for you, and it's whether do you think that the belonging and the search for home is at the center of humanity?
The question, as I read it, is: do you think the authentic characteristic of
humanity is belonging and the search for home? Yes. Yeah, sure. Translation is a true hospitality, but we what I want to underline here is that this is the happy part of the process. Otherwise, between two languages, there is also a friction and some fields of resistance and of hostility. So the role of the translator is to, as far as it is possible, or at least to some extent, to ease this tension and to normalize it. But it always stands somewhere there in the nuances. That's what I mentioned, this foreignness of the foreign text still stands, is left in the translation, in the translated text, in the receiving language. And actually this is very important, not only for the text itself, but for the receiving language as well. This is how language develops, not only by the originally written works, but also by the translated. Yeah, Linda?
Yeah, I mean, if I had a better intact memory, I'd be able to cite something from William Empson, which is actually used as an epigraph in a novel that I've been working on, not writing myself, but I'm trying to do some critical work on. And it's something to the effect that it is not human to feel safely placed. It is not human to feel safely placed. And I think that's why belonging and the search for home have such power, is because it's always a form of longing. It's never guaranteed. And therefore, as is so beautifully put in this question, the importance of hospitality. It's welcome to what I'm able to offer now. For all of us, I think the precarity of that is part of what makes us, part of what makes our sharing so precious, so urgent, that there, but for the hospitality of others, I would not be. I think, yes, another question.
Yes.
Could we share with those who've joined us which nature or city sites have inspired us as poets? How about you first, Nadia?
Well, I'm usually inspired by sounds and sound patterns and melodies and what I hear. For example, yeah, if we're speaking about visions and city sites, I live at the old center of Sofia, in a very strange place between several small streets with quite old, a bit some of the houses are in ruins actually. The place might be, such places might be seen also in maybe Portugal or Brazil. Usually when I sit on my back terrace and the sun is falling on the trees around, I feel quite calm and quite isolated from the city and inspired, but not because it's something beautiful or ugly or strange, just because it provides this strange, timeless isolation. And then I hear something. So it's again about sound and intonation and music and hearing. Linda?
Yeah, for me, there's a lot of the visual in promptings. My backyard is a perpetual source of promptings. We have a lovely little woods and a brook that eventually joins the Huron River, and the whole and various families of wildlife, deer, in abundance. And this is, I've been thinking I need to figure out a way to write about this at this time of year, because it's the beginning of rifle season here, of hunting season. It's the only time we see the bucks, the antlered bucks. They're normally quite invisible, but the margin of our woods, they know to be a site of safety. They're not being hunted here. So this is when we actually glimpse them. And it's a sign of their being really endangered, but I seem to use that word a lot, the danger, but again, the sort of fragile hospitality we can offer them when the rest of the land around here, as they know it, may be filled with people with shotguns. That cityscape for me is London. It's where, when we are able to travel, my husband and I spend another part of our lives. And I love the pavements. I love walking. I love the dailiness. I love the buildings and the parks and so forth, but it's the kind of rhythm of life in the city that really, really matters to me. We do have another question.
Yes,
now.
I just thought it's in the question and answer window actually.
Oh, okay.
Question
Yes.
landed the Q&A and also
Yeah.
chat.
Okay. Actually, there are two questions, one for you, Linda, and one for me. So maybe you should start with answering yours in the Q&A section.
In the Q&A, okay, yeah. I will go there. I've been in the chat. Okay, how does teaching creative writing affect your way of writing and vice versa? How much of your way of teaching comes from your personal writing experience? Right. I would say, let's see, am I going to answer that in the right order? Probably not. How does teaching creative writing? Well, teaching creative writing keeps me reading in a different way, reading emergent work. And also because I think it's really important that my students and I share encounters with published work. It keeps me reading. It gives me a different perspective on reading the work of my contemporaries, and listening for rhythms, for ways of thinking, for relationship to the spoken language that I'm not used to. So it's really a gift. It's, I believe and hope, keeps me open and to change myself. As to how my experience of writing affects my teaching, my experience of working on a poem, my foundational belief is that the difference between a poem and something that might almost pass for a poem is that in the poem, there has been an animating inquiry, some sort of question, some wish to discover, and therefore poems need to be tracking hungrily some space of ignorance, need to be driven to go to what is not yet known. And that's something I very much try to instill in my students, that a poem is not reporting in beautiful language on something they already understand. It's a very different process. Nadia, you.
As a person who is both writer and translator, how easy is to keep these two streams of consciousness, pun intended, away from each other? Yeah, if that's possible at all. Yeah. Well, I do not think of it as two streams. It's one, and it helps a lot to be a writer yourself when you translate. But also it helps a lot that when one is a keen reader. I'm a keen reader. I've been a reader all my life. And I think Borges says somewhere that as a writer, one can write just the things he is able to write. And as a reader, you can really be in touch with so many different worlds. So to be a translator really give me the chance to work beyond my potential, to write beyond my potential, to work with text that I will never be able to produce, which is so such a happy, that's the job of my dreams, to be able to do that. So yes, for me, it just helps. I never felt disturbed by the fact that I'm a writer myself when translating. Plus, as a writer, you're quite, you have this observing power on your own language, in my case on Bulgarian, and I know what are the little traps that might become fatal. For example, Bulgarian language, as most of the Slavic languages, they have this strange phonological specificity. There are lots of, how they're called, fricatives and affricates, these spirant sounds, and in many words, they appear in complex combinations, sometimes complex for pronunciation. And in translation, you cannot always avoid that. So when I'm translated into another language, or when I translate other things into my own language, I always have to keep in mind that, yes, there are these friction, as I called it, between the languages. So there have some compensations have to be made. Yeah, basically, I think I answered the question. And there is another one I can see in the chat. My question is about the problem of translation generally, that words and expressions in any language have more than one meaning than that the poet uses to evoke more than one meaning. Yeah, the translator must then choose at some point. You're discussing right now a bit. Yes, I think we answered a bit. And yeah, sure. Translator is in the position all the time to choose something and to compensate.
Thank you. Milena, I think we've gone a bit over our
Yes.
time, and that Paul is going to
Thank you so much,
give some
Linda.
closing remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Milena.
Thank you for this super moving conversation. You really made me longing for the time when we can enjoy the acoustic image created by your poetry, framed by the echo of a physical space. And even with some music by Nick Cave will be great. For me, his music really creates home for poetry and over a glass of wine. So I would like now to turn it over to our board member, Paul Vidic, who is writer himself, author of 4 novels, the fourth one forthcoming next year by Simon & Schuster, Mercenary. Paul, are you there? I'll ask you to unmute yourself. And for that reason, I'm helping with that. All right. So. And also, could you please start your video? Yeah.
Hi there. Thank you very much, Milena. And I am, as Milena said, a board member of the Elizabeth Kostova Foundation. And I'd like to thank everyone who made this event come together, particularly Milena and Elizabeth. But I'd also like to thank Gregory Gospodinov for his story about writers as the surgeons of the soul, and for Linda for her thoughts on wounds to the soul. It's the first time in our 13 years that we've celebrated with a gala. And of course it's online, which means we can't clink glasses of champagne together. But this platform has allowed us to bring together an audience from several different countries and time zones to hear the insights, the wit, the wisdom, and the humor of our extraordinary speakers. The work of the Elizabeth Kostova Foundation is urgent and essential for writers and translators, particularly as we journey through troubled times. I urge you to contribute to our cause. And with that, I will conclude this online event and thank our remarkable participants and you, our audience. Godspeed.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.